LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to the programme. It's Iain Dale here with you until 10, 6 minutes past 7. Now, many of you will have been watching or listening to a lot of the commemorations that took place yesterday to commemorate VE Day, which isn't actually until Thursday. Lots more events planned for Thursday all over the country. And I think anybody watching the events, not just at Buckingham Palace, but the parade, the interviews with lots of veterans, I don't think anyone can fail to have been moved by the event. But of course, we learned today that many of the younger generation know comparatively little about what went on in the Second World War. There's a More in Common poll out today, which we'll come to a little bit later, which shows that only a third of 18 to 24-year-olds know what happened on VE Day. 1 in 10 say Dad's Army, Captain Mannering, led the D-Day landings. I mean, it's quite incredible, the lack of knowledge about what happened in 1945, or the whole period 1939 to 45. So I thought, well, what should we do best on our first programme back after the bank holiday? And Tessa Dunlop, my partner in crime on the Where Politics Meets History podcast, she was telling me about a remarkable man called Colin Bell, not the former Manchester City footballer, but the former World War II Mosquito bomber pilot. And I'm delighted to say that he's with us today for this hour. He's going to take your calls. And I can say, Colin, welcome, by the way, I can say that this is the first time in more than 100 years of UK radio that a 104-year-old has done a phone-in. So well done for that.
Well, thank you very much.
And I have to say, you can watch this hour on Global Player. And if you watch us, you can see that Colin could easily pass for 75.
Well, I'm biologically 70. It's just that arithmetically I'm 104.
And I mean, that provokes a number of questions, but maybe you'd like to ask those questions rather than me. So Colin's going to take your calls throughout this hour on what VE Day means, what he did during the Second World War, because it's a fascinating story, it really is, and much more besides. So the number to call, 0345 6060 973. And Tessa Dunlop is with us for the hour as well. Tessa, you've tell me how you met Colin, because you clearly, you've got a very, just observing the two of you together, you've got a really interesting relationship.
Well, I actually met Colin in the RAF club in Piccadilly. I was looking for someone to explain what the controversy is relating to the Bomber Command Memorial. It's enormous, it's opposite the RAF club, and it's hugely controversial and was unveiled very late, 2012. Decades after these men served and fought. Their story was buried because it was deemed too controversial. A lot of the cabinet at the end of World War II felt queasy about the bombing of Germany, and there was a hesitation about how to remember their service. To put this in context, before we get stuck into Colin, over 55,000 men flying for Bomber Command didn't come home. They died. With the exception of the German U-boats, there was no more lethal operation than flying for the Allied Bomber Command. Yes, it was gruesome what happened on the ground in Germany. Yes, over 400,000 German civilians died, but it was a war. So how do you remember that? That was the question I was asking in my book, lest we forget, War and Peace in 100 British Monuments. And Colin is the voice for the Bomber Command Memorial. It's a very expensive memorial to keep up. It gets graffitied every year because it is so triggering for some. And I think Colin tonight will explain to us, I hope, as somebody who's fought a war, what it means to him and why he believes it's important.
What does it mean to me? Well, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that we were fighting a war for survival. The Germans had some very, very nasty plans afoot if they ever came over and subjugated us. So the first credit goes to the fighters in the Battle of Britain the heroes in the Battle of Britain that defeated the Luftwaffe. If they hadn't defeated the Luftwaffe, then we'd have had the Germans over here. And a very nasty experience it would have been too. But once we had defeated the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, and I emphasise I was not involved in that. I was too young, and I was just looking up at the sky, seeing what was going on. But it did encourage me to volunteer for aircrew, and eventually, of course, I became active in Bomber Command. Now, I always like to point out that the objective of Bomber Command was not to kill civilians, it was to destroy the German manufacturing capacity to attack us. And by us, I mean our men, our women, and our children. And by and large, I think Bomber Command did a pretty good job. I will go back to earlier on, but at this point, I'd just like to mention one event, and that was the bombing of Peenemünde. Now, Peenemünde was a research station where the Germans were developing the V1 flying bomb, the V2 ballistic bomb, and the V3 bomb, of which most people know nothing at all. And so Bomber Command under Harris sent out a fleet of Lancaster bombers, and I was not involved in it, I wish I had been, sent out a fleet of Lancaster bombers to attack Peenemünde. And they gave a most devastating raid, and the commandant of Peenemünde was lunching with Hitler, and when he heard the story of the damage, he came down to see what had happened. And when he looked around, he was so horrified, he had a seizure, and he dropped down dead, which I found deeply satisfying.
And Bomber Command itself, I mean, Tesla said that the monument has proved to be very controversial. And Sir Arthur Harris, the head of Bomber Command, I mean, he's become a controversial figure in history largely because of the bombing of many German cities in 1944, 1945, many raids of which you were involved in. And the theory goes that it was far too much, that too many civilians lost their lives because of those raids.
When you're involved in a war, you have to win. And those people and those young men who are critical of Bomber Command, I can understand how they feel, but they should bear in mind that if we hadn't won the war, they wouldn't have enjoyed being slave labourers under a German regime. Point taken?
I'm just playing devil's advocate, Colin. Yeah. I'm totally on your side on this. You took part in, I think, between 40 and 50 raids. 50. And you flew over Berlin, you dropped bombs on Berlin, and there was one occasion when you nearly didn't come back, wasn't there?
Well, there were one or two occasions.
Well, the one I've read about was quite a revealing.
The one that I think stands out one that stands out in my memory was when I was bracketed by anti-aircraft fire, and a shell landed under the aircraft, the Mosquito that I was flying, and it lifted it up, and it interfered with the fuel supply momentarily. I didn't know what had happened. All I knew was that the power to my propellers was suddenly cut off, and they just were windmilling around. And I had this wonderful Canadian ex-lumberjack who was normally quite unflappable, and he leaned across to me and said, "What do we do now?" Which I thought was a pretty silly question. I could put it more strongly. And I said, well, we wait, because after all, that's all we could do. We waited, and what seemed like 6 months, the this power came on, and I edged myself and the aircraft away from Berlin. And at this point, I leaned across to him and said, Doug, because that was his name, you weren't frightened, were you? And he said, no, I wasn't frightened. I was bloody terrified.
The other amazing thing about Colin is, and I've interviewed huge numbers of veterans, he doesn't change his story. When Colin speaks, this is the horse's mouth. Your recall is absolutely second to none. And I think Colin's also helped me understand just how dangerous it was, how exceptional you had to be mentally. Tell them next, Colin, if you would, about that scared Virgin flying Canadian. But I just want to finish my point. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why this giant monument was built. It does lionise war because it's also a recruiting tool. At any one time, every country is recruiting for its military. If you don't lionise your military, it's very hard to ask young men and young women to put their lives on the line today, like Colin did yesterday. You know the story about the Canadian guy who was very scared and you went and tried to make him feel better about his first raid?
Ah, yes. Well, I do tell the story that fear kills. And I tell the story with some diffidence because some people might think that I'm critical of Canadian airmen. It would be completely wrong. I have the greatest respect for Canadian airmen who came over, volunteered and came over and helped defend this country at its time of greatest need. They were the bravest of the brave, and I can't speak highly enough about them. But on one occasion, on my squadron, a young Canadian pilot and his navigator came in, and they were clearly, the pilot anyway, was clearly very worried. And he kept shaking his head, and I was on the other side of the room to him, and I could see he was disturbed. So and of course, the target that night was Berlin, and this was to be his very first operation. And so I walked across to him, and I said, "Can I help you? Is there anything that I can advise you on?" And all he would say was, "I'm not coming back from this operation." Well, after 2 or 3 minutes, I was not getting anywhere. So I walked back to my Canadian navigator, and I said, "Well, he's one of your compatriots, so perhaps you can help him." So my wonderful Canadian navigator, Doug, walked across, and he must have spent all of 5 minutes with him. But it didn't do any good, and he came back to me and said, all I can get out of him is this repeated statement, "I don't think I'm coming back from this operation." And he never did. It was very upsetting. But I'm quite sure, of course, we don't know what caused him to be lost on operations on that first night of his, because if you don't come back, nobody knows. But
did you ever have that feeling yourself? Because you went on 50 raids. There must have been. I mean, I don't know how. The more you do, do you become?
Well, perhaps I was fortunate in the fact that I wasn't particularly frightened. I think I was too thick to be frightened. And so there was a chap called Sailor Milan, who was a leading pilot in the Battle of Britain. And he said, in my experience, he said, survivors are those possessed of not too much imagination. And I'm coming back to our young Canadians. It just happened that couple were Canadian. They could have been New Zealanders, they could have been British, they could have been any nationality that were fighting as our allies.
Colin had a big incentive to survive every night, because you'd just got married, and if you got back home, you got a cuddle, didn't you, Colin?
I got married.
Yeah, you told me that you knew you had to make it back to Britain for your cuddle.
I got married in 1943 to the very best lady in the world. I was just incredibly lucky. But she joined me on the squadron, or just on the out. Actually, we hired the top floor of a house in Downham Market from a very kind couple. And she was there with a 6-week-old baby. And if anybody deserved a medal, it was my lovely Kath, because she had the unenviable job of seeing me go out at night, because her room looked out over the aerodrome, and waiting for me to come back. But I brainwashed her, and probably myself, into thinking that we were invincible. And I said, you need to have no trouble. I shall always come back. And after the first 5 trips, I think she believed it as much as I did. Fortunately, it worked out.
Colin, we have to take a break there, but we'll be back in a couple of minutes. It's 7:22, and we'll be taking your calls too, Colin. If you have a question for him, 0345 6060 973. It's 22 minutes past 7.
This is LBC.
Fairness.
Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
23 minutes past 7 on LBC. We've got so many messages coming in thanking Colin for his service. Colin is amazing. Thank you for having him on the show, says Cheryl. Colin is the definition of a national treasure, says Mark.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought of yourself as a national treasure, Colin?
No, I'm not a national treasure. I'm just an old geezer that was doing his best during World War II.
Right. Let's go to Adam in Westminster. Adam, what would you like to say to Colin?
Hi, good evening, Ian. Good evening, Colin. Colin, I want to ask you one thing. When you were going on these bombing raids at such a young age, what was going through your mind, especially when you were over Germany and all this flak bombing around you? What was going through your mind at these very frightening times? Because I can't even imagine the scariness of it, and I just am in awe of people like you, sir.
Well, it was quite simple, really. I was flying a Mosquito, which was the very best aircraft to fly in World War II. I was concentrating on the job of flying the aircraft and getting to the target and in enabling my wonderful Canadian navigator, bomb-aimer, to do his job. It was a joint effort, and we were just concentrating on what had to be done, and that was to identify the target and bomb and get in and get out. And, of course, getting out was rather important for us.
And the Germans were very good at shooting down planes, weren't they? I mean, you must have seen friends and colleagues being shot down around you.
Well, your point about the Germans being very efficient at shooting down, the propeller-driven night fighters couldn't fly as fast as we could, so their night fighters were not really a problem. The real problem was anti-aircraft fire. It was accurate, it was lethal, and then it became a matter of luck whether you were struck or whether you survived. I've already touched upon the shell that lifted us up, but I could complete the story by saying that in the morning we inspected the aircraft, and the back of it was like a calendar, and my fitter came up to me and said, "Sir, would you like to have a memento of last night's flight?" And I said, "Yes, but what is it?" And he handed me 2 pieces of shrapnel, each about 4 to 6 inches long. And I said, "Where did you find them?" And he said, "They were in your parachute that you were sitting on."
Oh, wow.
Which made me thoughtful.
I tell you, the other thing about Colin's stories, and I really learnt this, is just how valuable it is to trust your equipment. Look at the faith Colin had in his Mosquito. And that's why we have to fund the British military. You've got to believe in your arms.
And trust in your navigator as well.
Oh, yes, I trusted him implicitly. I chose him because he was an old man. He was at least 4 years older than me.
So like 27 or something.
And I thought he must have had a fair amount of experience. So I walked up to him and I said, "Have you found yourself a pilot?" And he said, "No." And I said, "What's your experience?" And he said, "What's yours?" And I said, "Well, I've been an instructor in the United States to American and British cadets." "Oh," he said, looking a bit mollified. He said, "Well, I've been a navigation instructor in Canada." And I said, "You found yourself a pilot." And I probably picked the very, very best man I could possibly have. I was very lucky to have him, and I told him so. But then I told him modestly that he's probably lucky to have me.
Yeah. And I think he was. Adam, thank you. Let's go to Graham in Clapham. Graham, hi.
Good evening, Ian. Thanks for having me on. I have a question for Colin. Sir, thank you for your service, firstly, and for sharing your stories. I currently serve as a military officer, and I wondered if, drawing on your own experience on operations and noting the challenges of today's military, what advice you'd give to those like myself who currently serve?
Well, advice I would give to any young man, and bear in mind anybody under the age of 80 is young to me, the advice I would give is be bold, but avoid being reckless. I found that being bold usually pays off. Certainly being reckless doesn't.
It's a fine line, though, isn't there? There's a fine line between being bold and being reckless.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, this is a man who broke records over 100 for abseiling, just to put Colin's idea of bold versus reckless in context.
You abseiled?
Yeah, well, after the war, not very long ago, I wanted to raise, in fact, it's what I now do. I just try and raise money for charity. And I got involved in a Just Giving programme, and to bring in the punters, it helps to do something daft. And somebody said to me, "Would you like to abseil down 17 stories of the London hospital?" And I said, 17 stories? Can you find me a hospital with 5 stories? And the guy said, "Well, it won't make much difference if you fall out from 17 or fall out from 5. The result will be the same." But getting back to the whole business of abseiling, doing something daft like that does attract the attention of the punters, and as a result, we got a very significant sum of money. I think it was significant. I think it came to about £57,500 or something of that order. And I always remember after I got down, some guy came up to me and said, if you keep my name anonymous, I'll write you out a cheque now. And I said, well, don't be bashful. Write out the cheque and sign it, and I'll see it goes to the right place. He said, you can give it to any one of the 3 charities you've named. And he wrote it out, and when I looked at it, it was for £10,000. Wow. So you see, the British public can be very, very generous, and I'm really indebted to them, and to that guy in particular.
And you did that when you were 100?
No, I did that less than 2 years ago.
102, just to clarify.
There are quite a few people on the text saying there is no way that Colin is over 100. Yeah. Well, on your life, you're 104 years old, aren't you?
Well, I'm beginning to head towards 105.
Now you're showing off, Colin. You only had your birthday a couple of months ago.
We'll take more questions in just a couple of minutes' time, but first we need the LBC News headlines with Amelia Cox at 7:32.
The government has rejected the suggestion a trade deal with India could undercut British workers. The Conservatives have raised concerns that Indian nationals working in Britain won't have to pay national insurance contributions initially. Donald Trump is hosting Canada's Prime Minister at the White House. Minutes before Mark Carney arrived, the US president posted online that America doesn't need anything they have except their friendship. And Conservative leader Friedrich Merz has won a parliament vote to become Germany's next chancellor during a second attempt. Earlier, he'd fallen 6 votes short of the absolute majority he needed. LBC weather, much of the UK staying dry tonight with clear skies in western and southern areas. Cloudier for the north and east, a low of 2 degrees.
Weekdays from 7 a.m.
Just eat the damn chicken and get a deal done.
Straight to the point.
This must be the turning point.
Uncompromising.
What, for the love of God, is the problem?
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
Got no better deal than the Taliban.
Listen on your radio and global player. LBC.
Concessions.
Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
7:34 here on LBC. We have with us Colin Bell, DFC. He is a veteran of the Second World War. He was in Bomber Command and took part in 50 different raids over Germany. We've been taking calls. We'll come to more calls in a moment. But before we do, Colin, and Tessa Dunlop is here as well, my co-host of the Where Politics Meets History podcast. Colin, Dresden, we talked a little bit about it earlier. but it's become emblematic, I think, of for a lot of people about so-called over-bombing of Germany.
Yeah. Well, let's get Dresden in its correct context. People think of Dresden as being a place where they made little German shepherdesses. Nothing is further from the truth. In 1944, there were 10,000 war workers in Dresden, and they were engaged in making periscopes for U-boats. They were engaged in making cockpits for the Luftwaffe aircraft. It was a real manufacturing base. And more than that, Dresden had very, very important railway yards, and there were vast numbers of troops being ferried through Dresden towards the Eastern Front. And the Russians were screaming out for those marshalling yards to be neutralised. And so Dresden was properly identified as a target for attack. And so we attacked it because it's all in keeping with the objective of Bomber Command, which was to destroy the ability of the Germans to attack us. And this instance, of course, they were manufacturing, and they were also routing troops to the Eastern Front. But you see, people don't know this, and that it's ignorance that enables people to take the moral high ground when, in point of fact, it's based on inaccuracies.
I think it's interesting that Dresden is always held up as the example. I met Colin, as we mentioned, through this Bomber Command Memorial, trying to understand the complexities of bombing in war, particularly our role bombing Germany. And I went to interview a historian called Keith Lowe, and he said, people always hold up Dresden, but what of the firestorms in Hamburg, in Würzburg, in Cologne? And he pushed back, and I think his argument would be, Colin, that what you guys did was extraordinary, but the way we've monumentalised it with that giant structure is not sufficiently apologetic, and the line across the back at the top is insufficient, saying basically it's sorry for deaths through bombing in the war. And I wonder what you would say in response to what Keith said.
Well, I think the point is that if you're in a war, you've got to win it. It's no good fighting a war with one hand tied behind your back, because you merely perpetuate the time that the war goes on. I have no hesitation in saying that we carried out our attacks on Germany in a proper manner. We didn't attack targets that were just civilian targets. We always attacked manufacturing centres. And, it was just something that had to be done. And apologies don't enter into it.
And that's what Colin's taught me, funnily enough, because I know a lot of people think, I'm on the progressive left. But actually, those who are fighting a war, their vision is very black and white. There's very little nuance.
And also, I think it's right that the city of Dresden gave their permission for this memorial, didn't they?
Yeah,
it's a bit like
it was consulted.
In the Falklands War, the captain of the General Belgrano admitted that he would have sunk it if he had been the British admiral in charge of the fleet as well. So sometimes it's very easy to fall for these sort of popular myths. Let's take another call from Jimmy in Newham. Jimmy, hi.
Hello, hi. Can you hear me there?
Yep.
I'm just so amazed, and sadly enough to say it, I think the only way certain people are going to understand what Colin and the other brave people that went through that protected our freedoms of today would be to experience that. And that's sad, because we can create chapters, write literature, but unless they experience what Colin and those intrepid, amazing people who created our freedoms of today, which they enjoy, where they can sit and watch Netflix and order a kebab, which others don't have, unless they experienced it, will they truly understand it. It's so sad that we have to answer questions such as this, and Colin and other people who preserved and created this freedom for us in Britain have to answer this. And me, as a youth worker who works with young people, I would like to ask Colin, what advice could he give me that I could pass on to young people? Because we've lost that patriotism, we've lost that feeling of belonging, and it's especially our young people, our Generation Z especially. We've lost that. We've lost that feeling. This is the feelings that. So, what advice would Colin give to me that I could pass on to young people when educating them about this, our country, our beloved country?
He's laughing.
You'll have to condense that question.
Well, what advice would you give Jimmy as a youth worker to pass on to the young people that he works with? Because I think he feels that those people, they've lost the sense of patriotism. But maybe in 1937, 38, 39, maybe a lot of people then thought that the young generation wouldn't step up to the plate.
Well, now we know. In 1937, because you remember, I can go back a long, long way. In fact, I can go back to when I was 2 years old, but we won't go into that. In 1937, I'm pretty sure it's 37, there was a motion before the Oxford Union that this generation will not fight for king or country in the event of a war. And, of course, the motion was carried. But when the war broke out, all those young men who carried that motion, saying they wouldn't fight for king and country, they queued up to enter the armed forces. So it's no good saying that people wouldn't fight to defend themselves now, because, in my judgment, they would.
But I did a phone-in about a year ago when the Ukraine war had started. There was lots of speculation that it could widen out into a European war. And a lot of the young people who phoned in said, yes, if Britain was going to be invaded, of course I would fight. But there were plenty of young people who said, I'm not fighting for Estonia. So there are parallels to be drawn, aren't there? Because in 1939, we were fighting for Poland, not just ourselves.
Well, in point of fact, of course, we realised that Hitler had to be stopped. And it wasn't a matter of just fighting for Poland. We could see that Hitler was intent on world domination. And he had to be stopped. And there's no question that we entered the war with that intention to stop him. And thank God we won. But probably it wasn't until the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor and we got the benefit of the Americans with us that we were certain of winning the war. I was out in Florida at the time, in Tampa, and I was doing the Light Fantastic with some young ladies, and the music stopped, and it said there would be an announcement by the President of the United States. And Roosevelt came over, and he spoke about the Day of Infamy, because it was December the 7th, 1941. And I felt an immense sense of relief, because I knew then that we had won the war, or we would win the war. And strangely enough, 3,000 miles away, Sir Winston Churchill, on hearing the news, said, "So we've won after all." It was an enormous amount of relief.
Because he had spent so much time and effort trying to persuade Roosevelt to come into the war, at least to supply Britain with ships and planes, and of course the bombing of Pearl Harbor made that almost inevitable.
He famously said that he'd studied Roosevelt more than any man had ever studied his own lover. Colin, you've just been... Yes, you say.
I'd like to say at this point that it's very important that we should never forget. And there's been a wonderful book written by my friend Tessa Dunlop here, and it's entitled Lest We Forget. And I recommend everybody who's got the interest of this country at stake to read this magnificent book.
Best plug ever.
Can I just tell you, I've worked for 10 years with veterans and never has one of them done that on air for me.
Well, there you go. Colin. Before we go to a break, let me just read out some text, because my screen, Colin, here is just littered. I say littered, that's a negative word. Is full of people wanting, they say, several of them want me to shake your hand on their behalf. So let me do that now, on behalf of everyone. This is particularly for Stephen, who says, can you shake this man's hand for me, please? My mum now is 93, going on 94, tells how she would watch the planes flying over her home going to Germany. They're all real heroes. This is from Adrian, 62-year-old from Bournemouth, watching Colin in awe, hugely impressed but disturbingly jealous. Yes. What moisturiser does he use?
Yes, that's such a good question.
I think it's appropriate at this time to pay tribute to the heroes, and I most certainly wasn't a hero, to the true heroes that flew the slow-moving bombers. I'm thinking of the Halifaxes, the Stirlings and the Lancasters, because they were slow-moving, heavily laden, they were flying at less than 200 miles an hour. I was flying at double that figure, and they were the heroes. They suffered very heavily casualties. The German night fighters would mow them down. They were even more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, and yet they persevered and went out night after night. So I pay tribute to those guys. They were the real heroes.
I thought you were going to pay tribute to Nivea for Men there, but they took a slightly different turn.
He doesn't need it.
He doesn't need it. Lots more text, lots more of your calls in just a moment. And, of course, cross-question at 8. It's 7:47.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
The lack of knowledge is quite incredible, and how important is it that the upcoming generation, know exactly what's going on? Only a third know what happened on VE Day. 66% haven't got a clue what the Battle of Britain is. Only around 33% knew who the Prime Minister was during the war. Professor Sir Hugh Strawn is leading military historian, Emeritus Fellow at All Souls College in Oxford, and Professor of International Relations at the University of St Andrews.
In 2014, we were staggered just how ignorant people were about the First World War. But when we get to 2039, we'll begin that process of commemoration again. And my guess is there'll be a fair amount of public education going on through that.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC.
Terms apply.
Iain Dale on LBC.
10 to 8 here on LBC. If you're not watching us on Global Player, you really should be. You can listen and watch Colin Bell, DFC, World War II Bomber Command pilot. Lots of people asking on the text is, what is the secret of living to 104?
Well, there are two answers. There's the honest answer and there's the amusing answer. And of course, as you may imagine, I've been asked this many times before. Well, the honest answer is the genes that you're born with, and I'm not talking about Levi's. If you're born with the right genes and you live a sensible life and don't get involved in drug-induced sex and all that sort of rubbish, then you might, with luck, live to 102 or even a bit longer. The amusing answer, of course, is it's a combination of exercise, alcohol, and the love of good women with the odd bad one thrown in. How's that?
That is good, Colin. But
Talking about women.
I'm a very bad woman, yes. We've been out already on the tiles on Sunday, you know, in a pub. But I've got to counter you because I spoke to a gentrologist because I couldn't get over just how all these veterans were so exceptional. In fact, a really horrible book reviewer said, she uses too many superlatives. But the truth is they are. So I talked to this professor and he said the truth is to get to over 95, 98, compos mentis, physically okay. Yes, it requires avoiding the big killers, but it's not just luck. It's actually your routine, dating way back into your midlife. It's the way in which you approach life. It's your mentality. It's whether you're optimistic. Colin, sitting here tonight.
Yes, Tessa, let me break in. There was a very famous character called Machiavelli. And he said, half of your life is luck and the other half depends on yourself. Now, don't ever underestimate the element of luck in your life. I've been very lucky.
Yes, but the other half, Colin, you are sitting here tonight outside your comfort zone, never done a radio phone-in before.
Yeah.
Outside of his bedtime. What time do you normally go to bed?
Well, lots of people want us to abandon cross-question and keep going on, but we're not going to do that. But I will get in Tyler in Leeds. Hey up, Tyler.
Hey up, Colin, and hey up, Mr. Bell, sir. Let me just say it's an absolute pleasure, honour and privilege to speak with you. It's funny you say that about the parachute, because my great-granddad, sadly I didn't meet him. He were a paratrooper on D-Day in Operation Market Garden. My question that I wanted to ask him and I want to ask you is, what was life like after the war for you and your friends? Did you get support? Did your wife get support? Because these days, a lot of, sadly, veterans of the British Army and Air Force are homeless and don't get a huge amount of support. Did you get help with buildings or extra ration cards? That's my question, and thank you for making the world a safer and better place.
So what kind of support did you get after the war? Because
I think I got, in a way, quite a lot of support. I was a trainee chartered surveyor before the war. I hadn't completed my exams, and I applied to the government for a position in what was known then as the Inland Revenue Federation Office, so that I could work under a qualified chartered surveyor and eventually qualify. My knowledge was practically zero, but out of the kindness of their heart, they found a position for me. I became a temporary valuation assistant at a damn nearly starvation wage, but it helped me develop a career, and it stood me in very good stead. So really, I'm very, very grateful to the government that gave me that opportunity.
But how did you adapt? Because you had this adrenaline rush for I don't know how long, going on all of these raids, hugely exciting and dangerous, and then suddenly you go back to normal life and train as a chartered surveyor.
It was difficult. It was difficult. I won't pretend that it was easy. It was difficult because I saw everything in terms of black and white. But I tell you one thing that has imprinted itself on my memory, and which I would recommend everybody in the UK to bear in mind, and that is the importance of adequate defence. And I don't think that we are doing enough.
Well, just on that, we've got a question on that from Dan in Leicester. Dan, go ahead. Dan, are you there? He's not there. So I've got his question here. It says, what are Colin's thoughts on the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, we're fighting a proxy war, aren't we? The Ukrainians are in effect our first line of defence. It's very controversial. I think that there's no question the Russians have got to be held back, because if they are not held back, they will be attacking the Baltic states. We've got a complete nut in Russia running the show, and he wants to restore, as he sees it, the Russian Empire as it was when it was under Soviet rule, and he wants to take back all those countries that seceded from Russia at the end of the war.
And do you think that we are now in danger of another European war, maybe more danger now than ever since the Second World War?
I think we're in a very perilous position, and I tell you why. Ever since the end of World War II, the country and Europe has been under the protection of the American umbrella, and it looks as if that American umbrella could be withdrawn. Now, my reading of the situation, and there are lots of people who have different ways of looking at it, my belief is that Mr. Trump wants to attract the Russians back into the fold. He wants to draw them away from China, North Korea and Iran, which the previous president, with his policies, however right they were morally, the effect was to drive the Russians into the arms of these despotic regimes. But in drawing Russia closer to America, you have a controversial position. How does President Trump support Russia and at the same time support NATO? It's very difficult.
I know you don't want to get...
the answer clearly is that the West has got to spend a lot more money on its defence, and it needs to do it now, not in 2 or 3 years' time when we can afford it. It needs to be done now.
Well, like a true professional, you anticipated my final question, which was, should we spend more money on defence? Yeah. So you've already answered that. Colin, as I say, you've got such love and support from everybody who's been texting into the programme. We're really grateful to you for joining us today. We're going to release this as a podcast, and I hope that a lot of schools around the country will play it to their kids, because I think you've said so much in this hour that I think could be a real use to people, to kids in schools nowadays.
It's been a great pleasure.
And I know this is a trite phrase, but on behalf of everyone listening, so I'm going to tear up now. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, Iain.
Thank you. And Tessa, thank you very much indeed. Lest we forget, is the title of
War and
Tessa's
Peace in 100
book.
Monuments. There are other veterans, but Colin stands alone.
It really does. Now, coming up in the next hour, it is, of course, time for Cross Question. It's the time of the day when you get your chance to ask our panel whatever question you like, frankly. We have an expert panel joining us today. We have Peter Tatchell, Human Rights Campaigner and Director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation, Laura Farris, former Conservative MP and Safeguarding Minister, Sarah Olney, the Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park, who's the party's Cabinet Office spokesperson, and Andy Preston, businessman and former independent Mayor of Middlesbrough, who's a donor to the Conservative Party, having previously supported Labour. Well, he's all over the place, isn't he? We'll investigate that in just a moment. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, a free trade deal described as the most ambitious